I'm very pleased to be joined once again by Chris Grant, who is CEO and founder of EPC Choice, but also a portfolio landlord himself. Well, Chris, we wanted to have a chat after the election because obviously the different parties had different manifestos, and energy and energy efficiency played an important role in some of those manifestos, including the Labour Party. And the Labour Party had what they called the Warm Homes Plan outlined in their manifesto, but then it was actually quite lacking from the King's speech. So what's going on with Labour and energy efficiency, do you think?
Well, I focused on the Labour Party manifesto, Vanessa, because I think we were all fairly certain the direction that the election was heading. So the Warm Homes Plan, as you said, was there. That touched on, made various pledges in terms of funding for energy efficiency programs for the PRS. But what stood out for me was that they pledged to ensure that the private rented sector met minimum energy efficiency standards by 2030, saving renters hundreds of pounds per year. Now, it didn't tell us what that minimum would be. We know currently it stands at E rating for landlords. Rishi Sunak, back in October last year, scrapped the interim requirement for C rating between 27 and 28, but ultimately still working towards 2030 for B rating. So this would indicate, and this had been previously costed by the incumbent government cost policies of the opposition. And I'd seen the costing document for this, and it does make clear reference to C rating in there and the cost of that to the sector. But it didn't go into the detail. It didn't say when it was going to be introduced and what those levels would be. Now, I left with a little bit of an egg on my face because I was convinced it would be in the King's speech and introduced as a bill. So here we are a week on, and there was absolutely nothing in the King's speech about the Warm Homes Plan or when it's likely to be introduced. So, 40 bills in there. Probably the only one that was particularly relevant to landlords is the Renters' Rights Bill. Now, that does make reference to the Decent Homes Standard, and also to AWAB's law as well. The Decent Homes Standard was under consultation for extension into the private rented sector, and that does actually make its own provision for a minimum energy efficiency standard as well. But again, there was lacking in detail there. So I think the thing is that it is still on the agenda for landlords. I don't think any landlord should take the risk of getting caught napping on the improvements that they're going to need to be made. Unfortunately, we've still got this uncertainty with the timescales.
Well, again, it's this uncertainty that we've spoken about in many areas of private sector renting, and it seemed, as we said, to be quite important. It was in the manifesto, but then not in the King's speech, and landlords are kind of left hanging on. But I think what we should summarise, Chris, is there is no doubt the direction of travel in terms of energy efficiency in private renting, and landlords shouldn't really just bury their head in the sand and hope that it's going to go away, because I don't think it is. Do you?
I don't know. And they've made pledges about the funding being available for landlords to do this. The funding is actually already here. So we've got Eco4, we've got the Great British Insulation Scheme. There's lots of local authority funding that's available via schemes known as HUG and LAD as well. And these will be specific to your local authority. They will be dependent on means testing in some cases of tenants and also the current EPC rating. But the money is there. And it's important for landlords to take advantage of it at this stage and any future funding that Labour bring into place as well.
Now, with EPC Choice, all of your operatives are qualified energy assessors, aren't they? They have to be, but also your staff that are in the office are as well. And if you go out and you do an EPC and it's lacking in some areas, one of the things that you can do, and indeed it's on the EPC itself, but it'd probably be helpful to have an additional kind of discussion, would be how to get that rating up. And can you kind of advise on how to do it in the most cost efficient manner in terms of, you know, seeing what grants are out there, or if you recommend that if you got an A+ rated boiler, it would really help, or things along those lines?
Well, the EPC itself will always have recommendations unless everything has been done in a particular property. A lot of the conversations we have with landlords in regards to this, and bearing in mind, I know we've touched on the benefits of C rating and above in terms of funding. But the recommendations are there on the EPC. But one of the things that throws a lot of landlords is that the way that they're listed shows you the cumulative effect of each of the measures listed. So that's relatively straightforward to identify the uplift from any one measure, because you simply take away the uplift from the previous improvement. But that does take some explaining, and it's not foolproof. So what we're able to do, we've got lots of very clever tools at EPC Choice where we can actually dissect an EPC that we've provided, break down the individual recommendations to ensure that whatever the landlord was doing is bringing in maximum bang for their buck in terms of the investment, the grant that they achieve, and to get them to that critical rating that they're looking to achieve. So that's where the consultancy part of our business, which was huge in the run-up to C rating being scrapped, is still there, and we've still got that infrastructure to deliver what landlords need.
What do you recommend are probably the easiest, most cost-effective ways of boosting an EPC? I mean, I always say, you know, think about the boiler if it's over 15 years old, I guess. But, you know, if landlords are going to do these upgrades, I think they should do them with a view to future-proofing the property and doing them to the highest possible standards and ratings. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely think ahead in terms of the work that you're doing. It's surprising, Vanessa, how many properties we still encounter with minimal loft insulation.
Yeah, it's quite
And
straightforward.
yeah, very simple to do. One of the mistakes that people tend to make is that it's great putting in your loft insulation, but then if you board over it, you're effectively killing the effectiveness of it. We can only measure the depth of the insulation that we see, and if you board it over that, that's only going to be as deep as the joist. So wherever possible, listen, we all like throwing rubbish up into our lofts and storing it there for years to come and never using it. But the reality is, even if you have boarded over, get another layer of insulation on top of your boarding. That will actually count towards the EPC rating and the overall efficiency of the property itself. Similarly, with the boiler that you touched upon, most boilers now are condensing boilers, but the key to getting the maximum rating out of your boiler is to ensure that your energy assessor isn't cutting corners. Now, I can speak for our guys that I know that we would never do that. So we must always record a specific make and model, because we're going to pull down the efficiency data from the boiler database, and that will potentially add more points rather than just using the generic category of a condensing boiler. So again, we can identify most boilers when we're on site because we know where to look for the make and model numbers and just to extract that maximum rating from that element of the data.
Well, that's very useful to know. Now, as we know, an EPC is valid for 10 years. But you are quite an advocate of having an EPC done on a more regular basis for some very valid reasons. And you know, we were going to discuss on this call why it's maybe worthwhile to have an EPC redone after a few years. Do you want to run through those?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a case for having an EPC done following any improvement works that relates to energy efficiency. So yes, if you've had double glazed windows, if you've added to that loft insulation or a new boiler, because you will see an instant uplift from those three elements alone. Even if you haven't had those improvement works, An EPC any more than, as I've said, 3 to 5 years old is likely to be out of date just because of the software changes.
Mm.
So EPCs are produced using a standard piece of software. It's called RDSAP. It's common to all energy assessors. It is regularly updated, and typically every sort of 12 to 18 months, there'll be a major revision. We're currently waiting for the introduction of RDSAP 10, which makes EPCs more accurate again. So I would say that if you've got a property that's perhaps borderline, maybe is D rating now, you're refinancing, looking to get to that C rating, don't rely on that old EPC. It's a perfect opportunity to get one done with the latest version of the software, and the chances are it will be more accurate. More accurate invariably means higher rating.
Mm. Well, that makes sense. And also, you've mentioned that to me off camera that you've had a look at various surveys, and they've shown that 30 to 40% of EPCs contain inaccuracies, which may lower the rating as well. So that would be another reason to consider having an EPC done again, just to make sure that you've got the the most recent software doing the assessment.
Absolutely. A typical week at EPC Choice, we can get anywhere between 10, 15, 20 inquiries from landlords that may be about to renew their EPC or have just got some degree of concern over the accuracy of their EPC. So, there'll be glaringly obvious issues on an EPC if it's wrong that we can identify. And this does take us back to energy assessors sometimes lacking in qualifications, not having sufficient experience in the sector, which is why we surround ourselves with the industry leading experts to provide accurate EPCs. But 30 to 40% is a shocking statistic.
Mm.
It's well documented. But we're really making strides within the industry to ensure that accurate EPCs are fundamental to the landlord's energy efficiency journey.
And I guess the final thing we were going to chat about was EPCs in HMOs, because there's a lot of talk on the forums about whether they're required or not. And you have the definitive answer for us.
Well, we do, and this is a sector we're very heavily involved in. I've been a HMO landlord myself, so I can't afford to get it wrong. So if we look at the government guidance notes as they stand, and these are recent, so 2020 domestic private rented property minimum standards. So this is coming in under the MEES legislation rather than any earlier legislation. So it asks the questions whether HMOs are excluded from the minimum standard regulations. HMOs are not excluded. But in terms of whether a HMO is required on any one property, you do have to actually look at the nature of the tenancy, and the guidance does refer to this. So if the HMO is let on a single tenancy, let's say to 5 tenants on a single AST, yes, an EPC is going to be required. It's not excluded, and the EPC will need to comply with a minimum EPC rating of E. It gets more complicated when it comes to the renting of the individual rooms, because the EPC software is not designed to produce an EPC on a room. It can't take an EPC as from part of a building. So, and if you've let that individual room on an individual AST, and let's call it, flat 100 Arcacia Avenue, obviously, if an EPC was required, it would need to match the AST in terms of the address in order to avoid any confusion when it came to the section 21. But the EPC software cannot produce it on a room. So in that scenario, an EPC isn't required. So you can let that individual room without an EPC being presented to the tenant. Now, where does this come from? Well, a test case back in 2018 between County Courts in Home Group Limited and Henry being the tenant, where the judge concluded that HMO was not a building or a unit within a building, and as such, an EPC was not required. And the landlord, having not served an EPC, gained possession. So I think that's critical in terms of that reinforcement of the guidance and the legislation as it exists. So if you're letting the whole house to tenants on one tenancy, yes, EPC required. Individual rooms, you can't produce an EPC on an individual room, and the law proves that you'll gain possession under Section 21.
Well, that's very helpful to have that clarified. Chris, your phone line's ringing all the time with landlords, with EPC issues. Is there anything interesting that's cropped up recently, or any kind of trends that you're seeing?
Despite the uncertainty, we're still seeing C rating on the agenda, primarily for remortgages. We've seen where interest rates are creeping down now, despite the headline rates still being the same. But the lenders seem to be entering into a little bit of a mini price war at the moment. We're seeing buy-to-let rates creeping down towards 4%, which is fantastic news. A lot of those mortgages will have a minimum C. We had a particular lender last week where B rating was a requirement, with the borrower getting almost a 1% discount. So landlords, again, it's very much on the agenda, although it's not set in stone in that respect. And again, we love giving advice to our landlords on how to achieve it. There is this perception that it's going to be costly to upgrade, but sometimes some of the smallest and sort of cost-effective changes can really get you an uplift, which is going to open doors on funding and future-proofing your portfolio.
Well, it's awesome to have you part of our community, Chris, because as I mentioned, you've got a nationwide EPC business, but you're also a portfolio landlord yourself. And it's so great to see you on the forum, posting news and updates about EPCs and answering questions. And, thank you very much for your contributions, because they're really adding to the landlord databanks about EPCs, which is an ongoing topic that we'll need to keep abreast of going forward. So thank you very much for joining me on this call and for your support of Property Tribes.
Thank you, Vanessa.